Let's try, as we think about this, to set some goals. Create a narratively driven experience where the narrative elements are nonlinear and they talk to each other, they interact with each other, they bounce off one another. Not at the level of a Last of Us story here I'm talking about, or a Bioshock story. We're trying to keep it very simple, but I want you to keep in mind that the goal eventually will be, once we have these systems in place, to actually apply real, interesting, meaningful story. But the system comes first. So there's this complex web of sort of alliances, allegiances. There are different characters. We've written lots of different characters. There's Shodan and Elizabeth and Andrew Ryan. They all have different characters that are basically independent of any game systems. And people like them or hate them or like spending time or don't spend time with them. Well, independent of how you feel about them systemically, you're going to feel about them, hopefully, if we do our job right, as people. There will be false friends, leading people on, betrayals and reconciliations. You could, if you do your job right, end up simulating something along the lines of this. The individual pieces don't speak to each other. They do emotionally, like what happened to Booker at the beginning of Infinite, talk to what happened at the end in the player's mind, but the game, they don't really do that in linear narrative. Linear narrative doesn't really fully embrace the unique power of games, which is replayable and player-driven. If you want that, because it's your game. And the system, unlike where you can't really do that in a game like Infinite, right? This game, I think, would allow for that. So I support it in concept, absolutely, because that's the kind of games I love. I like setting every little checkbox myself.
I was never motivated for a character to dislike me.
Just like real life, you could be nice to somebody all day long, and just by being nice to that person and ignoring the other person, hey, you're doing game development and your wife's at home waiting for you.
How do you think this game would work if you eliminate a main quest and these side quests were the entire game?
So I don't actually, main quest is a really interesting question. Do you need a main quest? I don't actually know. We've been talking about that.
Is dying, and my only way out of here is with one of them.
Judas, a project by the Bioshock creator Ken Levine and his team at Ghost Story Games, has generated considerable excitement and speculation since it was first announced at the Game Awards in 2022. This narrative-driven first-person shooter set on a starship in disrepair appears to follow a similar gameplay style to Bioshock, with a strong focus on player choice, supernatural powers, and moral dilemmas. The title has been eagerly anticipated due to Levine's reputation for complex storylines and immersive worlds, yet it introduces unique mechanics and a fresh environment sets it apart from the Bioshock series. When Judas was announced, it immediately drew comparisons to the Bioshock franchise. The trailer showcased dark visuals, supernatural powers, and a familiar first-person perspective reminiscent of the iconic series. However, there are some key differences. Judas features a more isolated, sci-fi-inspired setting as players explore a decaying starship while forging uneasy alliances for survival. Journalists and fans alike recognize the hallmark elements of a Levine game: the immersive atmosphere, narrative weight, and eerie but familiar art style. But were equally intrigued by the game's apparent focus on collaboration or betrayal, which suggests more dynamic player-driven outcomes than before. In Bioshock, players were faced with choices that affected the story's moral landscape, though outcomes often converged toward a few fixed points. Judas, however, promises to take player choice further, potentially with branching storylines and complex character relationships that emphasize alliance and betrayal. This heightened emphasis on choice reflects Levine's evolving vision, as he aims to build on Bioshock's legacy of morally nuanced storytelling within a new sci-fi setting. Though Judas may not directly link to Bioshock's narrative or timeline, its exploration of human conflict and ethical ambiguity makes it a spiritual successor of sorts. One key element of note about Judas is that despite it clearly could not be directly related to the Bioshock universe, it clearly will be anyway.
My whiteboard drawing of it, and it's evolved a bunch since then, but the core ideas have really fundamentally remained the same, and that give you a sense of the genesis of it. And then I could take you through well, why the time period?
Yeah.
I've always been very interested in character because that's how I come from film. But characters are really hard to do in games because of all the things that games do combat great, games do exploration great, but characters really tough. The next sort of big first person, environmental game we did was Bioshock, and graphics had evolved at that point enough where the world could be a character, but also we could bring Atlas, we could bring Andrew Ryan in, we could bring Tenenbaum in, but they were all pretty much behind glass. The most developed characters in that game were Big Daddy Little Sister, but they weren't like dialogue characters.
Yeah.
But you saw them in the world, in their ambient place, and they feel like they live there and belong there. But we were still like, well, you don't really have a character that you interact with who's not really effectively in a cutscene. So with Infinite, Elizabeth was the big push. Like, how do we get you to have a companion character who you really feel like you're going on this journey with? You're seeing her evolve, you're seeing her change. And I remember we got to this point on the game development, which was fairly late in the development. And I was like, I said something really dumb, the kind of thing that everybody would groan at when you're late in development. Is like, it'd be really cool, guys. What if, Elizabeth could get mad at you and she could say, well, screw you, Booker. I hate all this stuff you've done and I'm going to bail.
I'm out.
And it came out of my mouth and I was like, oh my God, we can't do any of that. Hey, I want to do a single player game, but no online component, no multiplayer component that's entirely focused on how can you make a single player experience different for every single player that plays it.
Ghost Story Games, formed in 2017 by Ken Levine and several former members of Irrational Games, carries forward the legacy of the studio responsible for Bioshock 1, 2, and Infinite. After the closure of Irrational Games following Infinite's release, Levine's new team focused on creating more intimate, narratively complex games. Development of Judas has reportedly been challenging, with several design changes and reboots along the way. Despite these hurdles, Ghost Story has stayed committed to their vision of redefining narrative-driven gameplay, with Judas as their flagship project. In early gameplay footage shared by Geoff Keighley, players were given a closer look at Judas's core mechanics and story elements. Keighley described the game as visually stunning and remarked on its blend of familiar Bioshock-style combat with innovations in narrative-driven choices.
Now there's still room for you in the mission, Neffy, I swear.
Don't you ever call me that again.
The footage suggested a more open-ended experience compared to previous Levine games, with decisions that directly influence relationships and storyline progression. Keighley's experience underscored the game's ambition to push beyond traditional first-person shooters, emphasizing a more immersive narrative structure where choices carry substantial weight. In the context of Ken Levine's work, the character of Judas remains mysterious, though one of the running theories is that her real name is Cassandra Rosenberg, a name briefly flashed on the screen of the second story trailer. Possibly a daughter of a Rosenberg as described by Levine himself. Supposedly the man who built Mayflower, the spaceship the story takes place is in. This ties into hints in the trailer where references to Rosenberg appear, as well as the portrayal of three prominent antagonists, the Big Three, who might have ousted her father in a coup. Cassandra seems to be a key figure tied to the ship's origins, with her father's legacy playing a pivotal role in the story. These antagonists are seen interacting with her in ways that suggest both power struggles and personal vendettas. For example, footage from the trailer shows one of them giving Judas a skull-shaped cookie, potentially a symbolic gesture tied to manipulation or threats. As the main character, Judas will likely interact with the Big Three and other characters on the Mayflower through systems emphasizing alliances, betrayal, and choice-driven outcomes. Judas may represent a figure who is both protagonist and anti-hero, faced with the tension between survival and morality. Moreover, it's more than likely that Judas is aimed to be an enemy to herself, as two sides of the same coin. In the story, Levine may very well be again leaning heavily into themes of time travel as he did with Bioshock Infinite. Ken Levine's journey from Bioshock creator to Judas visionary has been marked by creative evolution and change. After the success of Bioshock and its sequels, Levine chose to dissolve Irrational Games, citing a desire to work on smaller, more focused projects. This decision led to the formation of Ghost Story Games, where Levine aimed to innovate narrative mechanics with more player agency. Judas represents the culmination of years of experimentation, standing as both a tribute to and a departure from Bioshock. With the IP remaining with 2K Games, Levine is free to explore new worlds without the burden of expectations tied to the Bioshock name. This decision was heavily influenced by the toll the project took on his mental and physical health, as well as the impact it had on his personal relationships. Levine initially approached Bioshock Infinite with the aim of creating a larger-scale blockbuster, one that could potentially resonate with an even broader audience, something he described as wanting it to be like Irrational's version of Call of Duty. However, as he worked on this ambitious title, Levine found himself increasingly trapped by the pressure to surpass his past successes, which left him feeling emotionally and creatively drained. Levine has openly spoken about how the intensity of working on Bioshock Infinite affected his health, saying that by the end of development he looked years older and was experiencing significant burnout. Levine felt that if he were to take on another Bioshock game, it could ultimately lead to losing his mind and his marriage due to the extreme stress involved. Levine's shift away from Bioshock and the AAA model allowed him to form Ghost Story Games. This new, small but ambitious studio has dedicated years to refining Judas. While this project undoubtedly will stand apart from Bioshock in many ways, its moral complexity and thematic depth assure its place within the legacy of immersive, story-driven games that Levine pioneered. With 2 story trailers and countless on-screen and off-screen interviews, all that's left for Judas is a release date, which will not come anytime soon as the title has not been slated even for a next-year release. However small comfort it may be, we can at least find solace in the fact that after nearly 10 years, Ken Levine is finally working on a video game title on his own accord. And if that's not worth waiting for, well then what is?